And those have been, some of those have been radiocarbon dated, and that's how we know how old they are. If you can't get a radiocarbon date on the paint, for one reason or another, there's not enough carbon left in the paint from whatever the binder the artist used was, we can do sequences based on superpositioning. So if I have this large white human figure, and then the baseball-like figure is painted over it, then I know that that large, round, baseball-like figure is layered. I don't know how much layered, but I can start putting these in sequence, and I can start looking at what other kinds of archaeological evidence is consistently found with what kinds of figures. So these large, triangular-bodied, kind of stiff human figures with the dangling arms, and they often have pretty big hands and feet, are associated with the early agricultural period that we call Basket Maker II in the Colorado Plateau sequence of archaeological phases. So if you have a rock shelter with Basket Maker II period remains, early corn storage, certain kinds of baskets, no pottery yet, then you're very likely to get this kind of large figure. The shield-like figures, which is what the baseball really is probably a shield. Those seem to be associated with a much later time period in, say, the 1200s, that we call the Pueblo III period. So it's the same period as the cliff dwellings and so forth. And oddly enough, in both time periods, people use rock shelters a lot. And the shield, if they're superpositioning, the shield figure is always on top of that triangular body human figure. So that's how we get a sequence. You'll also notice two kinds of handprints in this picture. Get my little arrow to come up. These over here are direct prints on the wall, put paint on the hand, sometimes patterned, and print it on the wall. The one over here on the right is a hand stencil. So hand goes on the wall and then spit paint around it. The hand appears to sink into the rock when you do that, when your hand is covered with paint. And then you pull it away and there's a stencil left. The positive handprints with the patterning are almost always associated with Basket Maker II remains, early agricultural period. The negative handprints are most frequent in the Pueblo III cliff dweller period. So even though they're not on top of each other, they're I still have a sequence of associations. And we've built up a style sequence for various regions of the Colorado Plateau. Then we can compare artifacts that have certain kinds of styles on them with the rock art. And I can't radiocarbon date the pottery vessel either, but it came from the floor of a room at Hays-Gilpin 2 over by Winslow. And there was charcoal in the hearth, and we can radiocarbon date the charcoal in the hearth. Or if we're lucky, which we almost never are in Winslow, but we are over here in Flagstaff, we can get tree ring dates from architecture that has pottery in it, and then we know roughly how old the pottery is, and then we can look for the same kinds of designs in the rock art. So here we have a sun forehead figure from Hays-Gilpin 2 that we know from its associations dates to the late 1300s. And then I can see a Caccino-like figure from the Springerville area and say, my hypothesis is that this also dates to the 1300s. And then I can look around and see, do we have habitation sites that date to the 1300s in the Springerville area, and we do. And start looking for trails between those sites and try to build up inferences this way about chronology. Then you can look for depictions of artifacts in the rock art. So here's a Navajo shield that my husband Dennis is standing next to for scale. It's a really big thing. He's the same height as I am. And you have a warrior with a horned headdress, a large shield, two oversized arrows to the left there. And then if you look at this corner of the shield, right there, and diagonal across his body, he's holding a bow. And it's a recurved bow. And that recurved bow came in from the north with Navajos, or some of the Navajos. I think we've got multiple Navajo migrations, but at least some of them are coming off the northern plains with that recurved bow somewhere around 1500, maybe a little earlier, depending on how some of this evidence goes. And then here's a depiction of a hunter from the Verde Valley that we think dates to the 1100s or 1200s, and he's got the self bow, just a D-shaped bow. So another Navajo picture from Crow Canyon near Farmington, New Mexico, and you have recurved bows and these hourglass-shaped figures, and these are the symbols of the Navajo hero twins, Monster Slayer and Born for Water. So Monster Slayer's symbol is the recurved bow, and Born for Water, his brother's symbol, is the hair knot that the Navajos wear, the double loop of the hair. And if you hadn't seen recurved bows, or you hadn't seen them in the context of that shield figure holding the bow, so I've got a shield, a bow, and an arrow. Now I know what the bow looks like. So it's all about context. And then we can go to this and say, okay, these two are recurved bows. And then we go to the ethnographic record and even better ask some Navajos, what does this mean? It's the symbol of the hero twins. And obviously, if you've got horses, those didn't come over so Coronado brought them into the Southwest in 1540. So if we've got depictions of horses, we're post-1540. And in this case, we can look at the materials, which was paint that the government gave Utes to paint their barns. So it's commercial barn paint. This is in Southwest Colorado. And you got a little paint left over, and so the Utes are drawing pictures of men on horseback. And you can get a lot of clues about dating from the kind of horse tack that they're wearing. Is it a Spanish bridle? Is it an American bridle? The style of the saddle, is it a Mexican saddle? Is it an American saddle? And right next to that, you've got a gorgeous picture of a bison, which I don't have anything in particular to say, I just really like it. Then here's a Navajo account of raiding Utes. And what I find interesting about this, a couple of things. You've got some interesting headdresses here on people who aren't obviously engaged in battle, which makes you think about leadership and religious leaders potentially being involved in this. And he's carrying a self-bow. Most of them are carrying self-bows rather than recurved bows. And this is just something I don't know the answer to, but you'd think if they were Navajos, they'd be carrying recurved bows. So if I was being too strict about this, I'd say this has to be earlier than 1500, but it's got horses, so I know it's not. So then I'm wondering if they're signaling some information about ethnic identity by using different bow shapes in here than you would expect to see. And there's some pretty distinctive headdresses down here as well. So there's a lot going on in this panel other than just a battle. There's something about social identities and roles of individuals being explained here.